As I understand it, then, you have an instrument which composers want to use, which has limitations. And the makers of the instrument, the musicians and the composers, found two solutions to overcome these limitations.
Yes. The first thing we have to do is to adjust the length of the tubing. So we don't have to have a different instrument for each separate key. It's too expensive, for one thing. But let me show you this with another horn, a more modern instrument. There are two things we can do with this really great advanced instrument. You see it's still wound in this traditional hoop fashion, but instead of it always being in a hoop, there are two parallel pieces of tubing here, and this is a tuning slide. It enables the player to change the length in a very small way to make it sharper or flatter, to put it in tune with the harpsichord or the organ that he's playing with. It works like a trombone slide, except this one is very tight fit, and it doesn't move as smoothly as a trombone slide. But the other thing is to be able to take great chunks of tubing off. This is a removable crook. Now, let me see. I've got a pile of them over here. This one, obviously, is much longer than this one. This one plays in the key of F. That same series of notes, if I put the shorter crook in, is a fourth higher. You had more than two. You had these. They go on. Low B flat. A coupler. This. And another pile of things like that. They go onto the concert platform, weighted down with all this stuff. Put them on the floor, and in between movements they'd have to sort around and say, just a minute, Fred, where's the G crook gone? You know? The next piece is in G. It was quite a cumbersome arrangement, but it worked very well. Having got this far...
And that gave them quite a big enough range for composers to be able to write more interesting works, did it?
Up to a point. Up to a point. You see, there's still this other great limitation. That they're only able to get these few notes out, the harmonic series. And this meant that you could play in different keys, but you couldn't get really into a minor key. And you couldn't really play a satisfactory scale. In the middle of the 18th century, there was a horn player called Hampel, who was experimenting with different types of mute. I think most of us are familiar with trumpets. In particular, they have different sorts of mutes which they put into the bell of the instrument to change the sound. And he was trying something with a piece of leather and a cloth to see how it would work. And he found that when he put this object into the bell, it had a particular result, like this. Interesting. So he played another tone. Now, admittedly, a lot of those sounds are muffled. And the most muffled note would tend not to be used by a composer. He wouldn't write for it because it would sound too funny. But all the composers from the mid-18th century on wrote for a horn to be played in this way. Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven. And authentically, I suppose one should play all that music on such an instrument.
difficult do you find it to play on the original instrument?
It's not all that difficult. The listener has perhaps more difficulty because the listener has to adapt to hearing some muffled sounds. But you get used to it after a while. It's one of those sort of aspects. It's a sort of feature of the instrument which if you'd heard it like that all the time, you would have accepted. The horn, up to that point, was limited to the very high register, which meant only very strong players could play. What happened with this hand horn technique was that it brought the playing range much, much lower, so that more normal people could play. Or you might say, well, why don't you just build a longer horn so that all the available harmonics which are close together are brought down within the human range? That's all very well, but if the instrument becomes very cumbersome, it doesn't actually work very well. There's a sort of optimum length of tubing that works very well. And this hand horn technique blossomed, and that's when we had this golden age of horn writing.
It was Beethoven's great contemporary Mozart who wrote the most important works for the hand horn.